The letter arrived on a Tuesday, written in her mother's careful hand, and it told Louisa Atwood that she had exactly 1 week to pack whatever she could carry and board a westbound train, because the Atwood family of Richmond, Virginia, had decided they were done being embarrassed by her. She had read it twice standing in the hallway of her aunt's townhouse, the paper rattling faintly between her fingers, and then she had folded it into a precise square and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, and gone back into the parlor where her aunt was waiting with the expression of a woman who already knew its contents. There had been no argument worth having after that. Her mother had made arrangements. A position had been secured. A man in the New Mexico territory named Roland Finch was looking for a housekeeper for his ranch outside a town called Redemption, and the Atwood family had decided that sending their most troublesome daughter into the wilderness was preferable to continuing to explain her to their Richmond neighbors. Louisa was 23 years old, unmarried, and had spent the better part of the last 2 years refusing to be what her family needed her to be. She had refused 3 proposals from suitable men, had spoken her opinions at dinner tables where women were not supposed to have opinions, had read the wrong books and argued with her father's associates, and once, memorably, had written a letter to a Richmond newspaper under the name L. Atwood calling for the expansion of women's property rights in Virginia. Her father had received 3 separate calls from neighbors about that letter. He had not spoken to her directly for 6 weeks afterward. None of that felt like failure to Louisa. It felt, if she was honest, like the only version of herself she knew how to be. But the Atwood family had made their position clear, and so in the spring of 1882 she packed a single trunk and a leather satchel, pinned her dark hair under her best hat, and boarded a westbound train out of Richmond with $60 tucked into her boot, and the stubborn conviction that whatever came next could not possibly be worse than what she was leaving behind. She was wrong about that in ways she could not have anticipated, and right about it in ways that would take the better part of a year to fully understand. The train ride took 4 days and covered a distance that felt, to Louisa, like the steady erasure of everything familiar. Virginia became Tennessee, became Missouri, and Missouri became the flat, sweeping enormity of the plains, and then the land began to buckle and rise and turn red at the edges, and by the time she stepped off the train in the small town of Cimarron and transferred to a stagecoach heading south toward Redemption, she was surrounded by a landscape so completely unlike anything she had grown up with that it felt almost fictional. The sky was enormous. The air was dry and smelled of dust and sage, and the light had a quality she had no name for yet, a kind of golden weight that pressed down on everything in the late afternoon and made even the most ordinary things look somehow significant. Redemption, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1882 was a town of perhaps 400 souls, situated at the base of a range of low mountains that turned purple at dusk and salmon pink at dawn. There was a main street with a general store, a livery stable, a doctor's office, a small church, a saloon that also served as the town's only hotel, and a post office that doubled as the telegraph station. There was a barber, a blacksmith, and a woman named Mrs. Hargrove who ran a boarding house out of a large adobe building at the east end of the street. The whole of it could be walked from one end to the other in under 10 minutes, and yet somehow it contained within it the full range of human drama, ambition, grief, and occasional joy that Louisa would have said, before she arrived, could only be found in a real city. Roland Finch was not there to meet the stagecoach. Louisa stood on the packed dirt of the main street with her trunk at her feet and her satchel on her shoulder, and she waited for 45 minutes while the afternoon light shifted and the other passengers dispersed, and a small brown dog investigated the hem of her skirt with great seriousness. No one came. She asked the stagecoach driver if he knew Roland Finch, and the man pulled a face that she could not quite interpret and said that Finch's place was about 9 miles south and that he expected she'd need to find a way out there. and then he climbed back up onto the box and drove away. She was standing in the middle of an unfamiliar street in the New Mexico territory with a trunk she could not lift alone, and she had $60 and no knowledge of anyone in this town, and her family was 1,200 miles away congratulating themselves on having solved their problem. And she felt, for just a moment, the very specific terror of a person who has suddenly understood the full weight of their situation. Then she picked up her satchel, squared her shoulders, and walked into the general store to ask if someone could tell her where to go. The general store was owned by a man named Bert Calloway, who was 50 and round, and had the cheerful pragmatism of a man who had long ago decided that the best policy in life was simply to be useful to whoever walked through his door. He listened to Louisa's situation with his arms folded on the counter and a small frown that was not unkind, and then he said, "Miss Atwood, I'll be straight with you. Finch sold that ranch 3 weeks ago, packed up and left for Colorado. I don't know who told you that position was still available, but it wasn't me, and I suspect nobody out here knew about the arrangement your family made." The silence that followed that statement was one of the longer silences of Louisa's life. She did not cry. She had not cried on the train or in the stagecoach, and she was not going to start now in a general store in front of a man who was looking at her with the careful sympathy of someone waiting to see what she was going to do next. She took a breath and asked Mr. Calloway if he knew of any other work available in or around the town, and he thought about it for a moment and then said that Mrs. Hargrove sometimes needed help at the boarding house, and that he'd been meaning to hire someone to help with the store's accounts since his wife had taken on more of the sewing work, and that she should probably start with Mrs. Hargrove because a roof over her head seemed like the first priority. Mrs. Hargrove was a tall, angular woman in her mid-50s who had come out to the territory 10 years ago with her husband, who had died of a fever 2 years after their arrival, and who had subsequently built the boarding house with her own hands and her husband's savings, and had been running it with the efficient authority of a small empress ever since. She looked at Louisa for a long moment, taking in the good quality of her dress, the Richmond accent, the luggage that was slightly too nice for someone claiming to need work, and then she said, "You're a long way from where you started, girl. Can you cook?" Louisa said she could manage tolerably. Mrs. Hargrove said tolerably was fine for a start, and that she'd give her room and board and $2 a week to help with the cooking and the laundry and the keeping of the books, which Mrs. Hargrove could do herself but found tedious, and that if she wanted more than that she'd have to earn it. Louisa agreed, and that was that. The work was harder than anything she had done in Richmond, where the hardest physical labor she had been expected to perform was embroidery and the occasional tending of the garden. At Mrs. Hargrove's, she was up before 6 every morning stoking the kitchen fire and starting the breakfast, which had to feed anywhere from 4 to 9 boarders depending on the week. She washed linens and hung them in the dry New Mexico air, which at least made them dry fast, and she kept the accounts with the meticulous precision that was, it turned out, one of the few genuinely useful skills her Richmond education had given her. By the end of her first week, she was exhausted and sunburned, and her hands were rough in ways they had never been before, and she had also begun to feel something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular quiet satisfaction of work that actually needed to be done. She had been in Redemption for 2 weeks when she met Aaron Hayes. He came into Mrs. Hargrove's on a Wednesday evening looking for a room for the night, which was not unusual, as cowboys and ranch hands passing through often stopped there rather than the saloon if they wanted something quieter. What was slightly unusual was that he stopped in the doorway when he saw Louisa behind the front desk and gave her a look that was not the calculating once-over she had learned to expect from men in the territory, but something more like genuine surprise, as though he had not expected to find someone like her in that particular chair. Aaron Hayes was 28 years old, lean and brown from years of outdoor work, with dark eyes and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days and hands that were calloused in the specific way of a man who worked with rope and horses. He was not large in the showy way of men who wanted to appear dangerous, but there was something solid and self-contained about him that Louisa noticed despite herself. He wore a battered hat that had seen considerable weather, and a canvas coat over a blue shirt that had been mended at the elbow, and he carried himself with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who did not feel the need to announce himself. He asked if there was a room available, and Louisa said there was, and she told him the price, and he paid without argument and signed the register in a hand that was steady and clear. And she noticed that he wrote his name the way someone writes it when they have been doing it long enough that it means something to them. He was gone early the next morning, before breakfast, and she did not think much about it beyond noting that he had been quiet and polite, and had not done any of the things that some of the men who came through did, which was to assume that a young woman working at a boarding house was available for a certain kind of conversation she had not invited. He came back 3 weeks later. This time he stayed 2 nights, and on the second evening she was setting the table for the boarders' supper when he came in from outside and asked if he could help, which was so unexpected that she looked at him for a moment without answering. Men did not typically offer to set tables in 1882, at least not in her experience. He met her look with a straightforward expression that contained no apology or self-consciousness, and she said that she supposed he could and handed him a stack of tin plates. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, and then he said, "You're not from here." She said, "No, Virginia originally." He said, "Long way to come," and his tone held no judgment in it, only simple acknowledgment, and for reasons she could not entirely account for that absence of judgment felt like a kind of relief. She said, "It is," and left it there, and he did not press her, and they finished setting the table and the other boarders came in for supper, and that was the end of the conversation for that evening. But the next morning he was in the kitchen doorway when she was starting the breakfast, holding his hat in his hands, and he said, "I wanted to ask if you might allow me to say something." She said he could. He said, "I don't know what brought you out here, and it's not my business. But I've been coming through this town for 3 years, and Mrs. Hargroves never had anyone keeping the books that well. I happened to look at the ledger when she left it on the desk. You've got figures she's been overcharged on for a year at least." He paused. "You're good at this. Whatever you're doing here, you're good at it." She looked at him for a moment, startled by the directness of it, and then she said, "Thank you," and meant it more than she expected to. He put his hat on and said he'd be heading out and maybe he'd pass through again, and she said that the room would be here if he needed it, and he smiled at that, a small, genuine smile that changed the whole quality of his face, and then he left, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, watching him walk toward the livery. His name was Aaron Hayes, and he ran cattle. Not for himself, not yet, but he was working toward it. He had come out to the territory 7 years ago from Tennessee with $40 and no particular plan beyond getting somewhere large enough that his problems could not follow him, which was how he thought of it, and had hired on with a rancher named Gus Abernathy, who ran several hundred head of cattle on a spread about 12 miles east of Redemption. He had worked his way up from general hand to trail boss over those years, and he had saved carefully and thoughtfully, and he had in the last year purchased a small piece of land about 5 miles out of town with the intention of starting his own herd, small at first but growing. She learned all of this gradually, over the course of the following months, as he came through Redemption with increasing regularity. At first it was every 3 weeks, then every 2, and by midsummer it was most weeks that he appeared at Mrs. Hargrove's in the early evening with his hat in his hands and the specific expression of a man who has a reason for being somewhere that he is not yet ready to name directly. Mrs. Hargrove noticed before Louisa did, which said something about how thoroughly Louisa had trained herself not to expect anything from any man. The older woman said nothing for a while, only watched with the quiet amusement of someone observing a natural process she had seen before and had no intention of interrupting. But in August, when Aaron had been to town 4 Wednesdays in a row and had spent each visit finding reasons to be wherever Louisa was, Mrs. Hargrove said, while they were washing up after supper, "That Hayes boy doesn't come through this town this often for the pleasure of the scenery, Louisa." Louisa said she was not looking for that kind of complication. Mrs. Hargrove said that most of the worthwhile things in life came with complications, and handed her a plate to dry. It was September before Aaron said anything direct. The summer had been long and dry even by territory standards, and the town of Redemption had spent most of it dealing with the various consequences of heat and drought, and Louisa had been busy enough that she had not spent much time analyzing what was developing between herself and Aaron Hayes. What she knew was that she looked forward to Wednesdays. She knew that she had started noticing his horse tied outside the livery, with a small, involuntary lift of something in her chest. She knew that the conversations they had, which ranged from cattle prices to local politics to the books she had managed to borrow from the small collection kept by the town doctor, were the most interesting conversations she had on any given week. She had also written in early August a careful and factual letter to her mother explaining her situation, not asking for sympathy or rescue, but informing her family of where she was and what she was doing, because it seemed like the responsible thing to do. The letter she received in return, 2 weeks later, was brief. Her mother wrote that she hoped Louisa was making herself useful, and that the family was well, and that perhaps this experience would teach her to understand what she had thrown away. There was no inquiry about her health or comfort. There was no acknowledgement that the position they had sent her to had not existed. There was simply the breezy assumption that hardship was what Louisa deserved for being inconvenient. She folded that letter the same way she had folded the first one, into a precise square, and put it in the tin box where she kept her important papers, and she did not cry about it, but she sat on the edge of her narrow bed for a long moment looking at the wall, with the particular feeling of someone who has just had something they already suspected confirmed beyond argument. It was 3 days after that letter that Aaron sat with her on the front porch of Mrs. Hargrove's in the September evening, the air finally cooling after the long summer heat, and said, "I'd like to know how you came to be here, Louisa, if you're willing to tell me." She had not told anyone the full story. She had told Mrs. Hargrove the bare facts, that the position she had come for had not existed, and she had needed to find work, but she had not told her about the years of friction with her family or the letter, or the quiet, comprehensive message that she was the embarrassment they had decided to be rid of. She had not told anyone that because it was the kind of thing that, once said aloud, takes on a shape that is hard to put back in the box. But Aaron was looking at her with those dark, steady eyes and an expression that contained something she had come to recognize as one of his most consistent qualities, which was that he listened to things with his full attention, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually taking in what was being said, and she found that she did not want to deflect or minimize or give him the edited version. So she told him. Not all at once, but steadily, while the stars appeared one by one over the flat scrub country south of town. She told him about the Richmond years and the refused proposals and the newspaper letter and the way her family had looked at her, for the last 2 years especially, as though she were a problem that kept refusing to be solved. She told him about the letter that had arrived at her aunt's house and the instruction to pack and board the train. She told him about arriving to find the position gone and Roland Finch already in Colorado, and about deciding to stay anyway because going back was not something she could make herself do. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable, and then Aaron said, "Their loss, Louisa. I mean that plainly. Whatever they thought they were doing when they sent you out here, what they actually did was send the most capable, most interesting, most—" He stopped for a moment, and she saw something in his expression that was careful and deliberate, as though he was deciding how much to say. Then he said, "They sent you here and it is absolutely their loss, and I'll tell you something else. It is my very good fortune that they did." She looked at him. He held her gaze without flinching and said, "I'm going to want to say more than that when you're ready to hear it, but I figure that's enough for tonight." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You might be the first man who has ever said anything like that to me." He said, "Then the men you've known haven't been paying attention," and stood up and took his hat from his knee and said good night, and walked around to the back where the horses were, and she sat on the porch for a long time after he was gone with something warm and complicated moving through her chest that she was not quite ready yet to call by its name. The autumn came on fast and golden in the territory, the cottonwoods along the creek beds turning a clear, singing yellow, the mornings sharp with cold before the sun climbed high enough to warm things properly. Louisa found herself walking out sometimes in the early light before the breakfast duties began, just to stand in the open air and look at the mountains going pink above the town. There was something about the landscape that she had not expected, which was that it was beautiful. Not in the gentle, cultivated way of Virginia's hills and greens, but in a harsher, more uncompromising way that she had come to feel was actually more honest. The land out here did not try to appear other than what it was. She thought about that as a kind of standard in the weeks following her conversation with Aaron on the porch. He had said what he meant. Not dressed up in the flowery indirection that men in Richmond used when they wanted something, not calculated to produce a particular response, but simply said, the way a person says a thing they have thought about and decided is true. She had grown up in rooms full of people who said one thing and meant another, and the directness of Aaron Hayes was, she was finding, not just pleasant but almost physically relieving, like stepping out of a too-hot room into cool air. She thought about other things, too. She thought about the way he pulled his horse up and swung down with an ease that was completely unconsidered, no performance in it. She thought about the conversation they had had about the territorial government's handling of the water rights dispute that was causing problems for smaller ranchers that year, and how he had listened to her analysis of it and disagreed with her on one point with specific reasons and agreed with her on two others, and how the whole exchange had had the quality of two people actually thinking together rather than a man tolerating a woman's opinion while waiting for her to stop talking. She admitted to herself on a cool October morning while standing in the kitchen watching the sun come up over the eastern ridge, falling in love with Aaron Hayes. The admission had the quality of something that had been true for a while finally being named. He came to town on a Wednesday in mid-October with something different in his manner, a kind of purposeful quality to the way he came up the steps and through the front door that caught her attention immediately. He was carrying his hat rather than wearing it, and there was something that might have been nerves in the set of his jaw, which on him was such an unusual expression that she nearly asked what was wrong before he had said anything at all. He asked if she had time to take a walk, and she said she had an hour before she needed to start the supper, and he nodded and held the door. They walked south on the main street and out past the church to where the land opened up into the flat scrub, and the mountains were visible as a clear, unbroken line to the west. The afternoon was cold and brilliant, the sky a shade of blue that she still had not found a word adequate to describe. He was quiet for the first 100 yards, which was unusual for him, and she matched his silence and waited. He said, "I want to show you something," and she said, "All right." He pulled from his coat pocket a folded piece of paper and opened it and handed it to her. It was a deed, she realized, a land deed, and her eyes found the relevant information. 160 acres issued to Aaron James Hayes, registered in the territory of New Mexico, 1882. The land was 5 miles east of Redemption near a creek called Hondo Creek. She looked at him. He said, "I've been building something out there. Started the house last spring. It's not much yet, 1 main room and a kitchen, but the bones are good and there's water on the land, which out here is everything." He paused. "I have 23 head of cattle. I have a plan. I've been working towards something that I could stand behind without apology." She was very still, listening. He said, "I'm not a rich man, and I may never be one in the way that your family in Richmond would recognize. But I'm a free man and I'm an honest man, and I know good land when I see it, and I know." He stopped, and the muscle in his jaw moved. "I know what I feel when I'm with you, Louisa. I know the difference between someone I can talk to and someone I can't stop thinking about, and you are both of those things and a good many others besides. And I've been trying to find the right time to say this for 2 months, and I am going to say it now before I lose my nerve." She said, "All right." He said, "I would like to court you properly. I'm asking your permission for that. I don't have a ring yet, and I'm not making that ask today. I know it's not the time for that, but I want to be direct with you because you've told me enough about your life that I know you've had enough of indirect men, and I am not one." He stopped. "That's what I wanted to say." She looked at the deed in her hand and then at him, and there was a quality to that moment, the clear cold light and the big sky and this straightforward, serious man standing in front of her with his hat in his hands waiting for an answer, that she would remember with great precision for the rest of her life. She said, "Aaron, I came out here as my family's last embarrassment. I was packed off to a territory they barely knew existed to get me out of their dining room. I have been a scandal and a disappointment and a problem to be solved for the better part of 3 years." He said, "I know," she said, "so you should understand that if you're going to court me, you are not getting a sensible, agreeable woman who will make your life simpler." He said, "Louisa, I am not looking for simpler. I am looking for real," and something in the particular gentleness of his voice on that sentence moved through her like a wave, warm and total and impossible to argue with. She said, "Then yes, you have my permission." The autumn moved into winter, and Louisa Atwood learned what it meant to be courted by a man who did what he said he was going to do. Aaron came to town twice a week now, on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and on Saturdays, if the work allowed, he took her out to his land to show her what he was building. The first time she saw the house she felt a complicated rush of feeling, because it was small and rough-hewn and unfinished, and it was also clearly and obviously built with care. Every beam seated properly, every wall plumb, the stone of the fireplace laid with the patience of a man who knew what he was doing. She asked if he had built it himself, and he said mostly, with help from a neighboring rancher named Pete Morales and his 2 grown sons, who had been good enough to come out for a week in the summer when the heavy framing needed more hands. She had met Pete Morales once in town, a broad, warm-faced man of 50 who had come up from Chihuahua State in Mexico 15 years ago and had homesteaded land adjacent to what was now Aaron's, and Aaron spoke of him with the particular warmth of genuine respect, which told her something important about the kind of man Aaron was. Not everyone in the territory in 1882 was willing to work alongside Mexican ranchers as equals. The land had been claimed and contested and contested again in the decades since the Mexican-American War had shifted the border, and the tensions between Anglo settlers and the Mexican and Hispanic families who had been on this land for generations ran through the territory like a fault line. Aaron was matter-of-fact about Pete Morales in the way that spoke of a man who had made his own determination about what mattered and did not feel the need to explain it to anyone. She liked that about him enormously. By November, she had started spending her Saturday afternoons at the ranch when she could, sometimes just sitting in the open doorway of the half-finished house with a book while Aaron worked on the south wall or the linta for the horses, and sometimes talking, and sometimes helping in the ways she was learning to help, which were not the ways she would have known how to be useful a year ago. She learned to keep the fire going in the outdoor pit so it was ready to cook on when they stopped work. She learned where his tools were stored and could find them and bring them without being asked. She learned the names of his 23 cattle, which he had given names that were practical and unpretentious, things like Red and Number 7, and the one he called Professor for reasons he said he preferred not to explain. She wrote to her mother in November, a shorter letter than the last one but more precise. She wrote that she was well and had found stable employment and had made friends and was building a life in the territory, and that she hoped the family was well, and that she had met someone she thought very highly of. She did not say Aaron's name. She was not sure why, except that naming him in a letter to her mother felt like offering something up for judgment that was not available to be judged. Her mother's reply came in late December, and it was much what she expected. Her mother wrote that she hoped Louisa was not doing anything that would further embarrass the family, that the territory was known to be full of rough men with no prospects, and that she trusted Louisa had not lost all her senses along with her common sense in coming to think of herself as independent. Her sister Cecily had recently become engaged to a very good man from a good family, her mother wrote, and the wedding would be in March, and she supposed Louisa would not be able to attend. Louisa put that letter in the tin box with the others and went back to the kitchen and made a very good apple pie out of the dried apples Mr. Calloway had in the store, and she served it to the boarders at supper, and nobody said anything about the particular focused intensity with which she had been crimping the crust. Aaron noticed at supper, because he was there that evening for reasons that had become entirely natural, that she was quieter than usual. He waited until the other boarders had drifted away before he asked, and she told him briefly about the letter, and he listened with his elbows on the table and his eyes on her face, and when she was done he said, "Louisa, your mother has never met you, the real version. She has met the version she decided to see and found inconvenient." She said, "I know that." He said, "I have met you, and I am telling you that what I know of you is remarkable. I say that without sentiment, as a factual assessment. You came out here with nothing and made yourself essential and capable, and you're the most self-possessed person I know, and I know some very self-possessed people." He paused. "Their measurement of you is not the accurate one." She felt, for the second time, the wave of warmth and totality that she was by now fully prepared to name as love. She said, "You are very good for me, Aaron Hayes." He said, "I intend to keep being that if you'll allow me." She reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a quiet moment in the warm light of Mrs. Hargrove's dining room, with the winter wind starting up outside. Christmas in Redemption was a modest affair by the standards Louisa had grown up with, but she found it more genuinely warm than most of the Christmases she could remember. There was a gathering at the church that Mr. Calloway helped organize, and the town's Spanish and Mexican families brought foods that Louisa had never tasted and found extraordinary, and Pete Morales and his wife Alina and their 2 sons and their growing families came in from their ranch for the occasion. And Alina Morales, who was a small, sharp-eyed woman with an iron sense of humor and a warmth that was like standing near a good fire, pulled Louisa aside at some point during the evening and said, in her accented English, "Aaron has been different this last year, happier. I want you to know that I see that." Louisa said she was glad. Alina said, "He is a good man. Some of the best men I know have been the ones other people underestimated. You are one of them too, I think." Louisa thought about that for a long time afterward. The new year of 1883 came in cold and clear, and January in the territory brought with it the kind of cold that was not damp and heavy like Virginia cold, but instead dry and crystalline and somehow more honest, the kind of cold that made the air visible and the stars at night so sharp they seemed to vibrate. Louisa had learned enough in the past several months to dress properly for it, and she found she did not mind it the way she thought she would. In late January, Aaron came to town on a Tuesday, which was not one of his usual days, and found her in the back of the store helping Mr. Calloway with the month-end accounts. He waited with his hat in his hands, and the expression she had learned to recognize as the one he wore when he had made a decision, and was working out the execution of it. When she came out and said, "You're early this week," he said, I've been carrying something in my pocket for 2 weeks, and I keep deciding the timing isn't right, and I've decided that's just nerves and I should stop listening to them." He was fidgeting with his hat brim in a way she had never seen him fidget with anything. She said, "Aaron." He said, "Will you marry me?" He had said it directly, without preamble, with none of the formal, elaborate staging she had seen deployed in Richmond parlors, and somehow that made it more moving than any of those staged proposals had been to witness. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a plain gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, which was not the diamond that Richmond would have required but was instead something made for this place, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever been given. She said, "Yes." She said it the same way he had asked it, directly and without qualification, and the smile that broke across his face was the fullest and most unguarded expression she had ever seen from him. And she thought, standing in the January light outside Mr. Calloway's store with her future on her finger, that this was what it looked like when a person was genuinely seen and genuinely wanted. He held both her hands and said, "I want to be clear that I know what I'm getting. I know you're going to argue with the county commissioner about water rights and write letters to the territorial newspaper under your own name and refuse to be quiet when you see something wrong. And I want all of that. I'm not asking you to be smaller than you are," she said. "That is possibly the best thing anyone has ever said to me." He said, "I mean to keep outdoing myself." They were married in March of 1883 in the small church in Redemption, with Mrs. Hargrove in the front pew looking satisfied in the way of a woman whose prediction has been confirmed, and Pete and Alina Morales there with their family, and Mr. Calloway and his wife, and most of the town besides, because in a town of 400 people, a wedding is everyone's occasion. The minister was a serious young man named Reverend Cleese, who had come out from Ohio 2 years ago, and had adapted to the territory with more grace than he had expected. Louisa wore a dress she had made herself over the winter, cream-colored muslin with pale blue trim at the collar and cuffs, which was not what she would have worn in Richmond, but was exactly right for a March morning in the New Mexico territory. Aaron wore his good coat, brushed clean, and the dark wool trousers he kept for town occasions, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle with an expression that was not the formal composure of ceremony, but the actual, unguarded expression of a man looking at the thing he is most glad of in the world. She had written to her mother about the wedding. She had written a factual, complete letter explaining who Aaron was and what he had built and what kind of man he was, and she had written it not as an appeal for approval but simply as information, because she was a daughter and her mother was her mother, and silence felt like a kind of surrender to the narrative her family had built about her. She had not received a reply before the wedding. She was not entirely surprised. The ceremony was brief and real, and the words felt like the most honest words she had ever spoken in any formal context. And when Aaron put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her in front of the assembled town, there was a warmth and gentleness in it that made Mrs. Hargrove actually dab at her eye, which she later categorically denied. The reception was in the churchyard, which was not ideal in March but was warm enough in the afternoon sun, and Alina Morales had organized the food with her characteristic iron efficiency. And there was music from 2 men with fiddles who played the kind of fast, bright tunes that had everyone moving whether they intended to or not. And Louisa danced for the first time in a year and a half, and the evening went long and warm and good. And when they finally drove out to the ranch in Aaron's wagon under a sky full of stars, she felt, with a completeness that surprised her, entirely and simply happy. She had not felt entirely and simply happy in a very long time. The house on Hondo Creek had been finished through the winter, and Aaron had spent considerable effort making it ready for her, and she had told him she did not need elaborate preparation, and he had said he knew she did not need it but that he wanted to do it anyway. And so the kitchen had a proper stove now, and there were shelves for books, and the bedroom had a real bed with a frame he had made himself from cottonwood timber. It was small and clean and honest, the way she had come to feel about everything out here, and she walked through it on their first evening as a married couple with a feeling she could only call rightness. She wrote to her mother again in April, after a month on the ranch. She wrote about the land, which was beautiful in spring with the creek running full from the winter snowmelt and the grass coming up green along its banks. She wrote about the cattle, which she was learning, and about the work of the ranch, which was constant and physical and often frustrating and deeply satisfying. She wrote about Aaron, simply and honestly, about the kind of man he was and the kind of partner he was, and she wrote without defensiveness or the need to prove anything, because she was no longer asking for her family's understanding. She was simply offering her life as evidence of itself. This time her mother wrote back at more length. The letter was still somewhat stiff and careful, as all of her mother's letters were, but there was in it a shift in tone, subtle but real, towards something that was not quite warmth but was at least curiosity. Her mother asked about the land and about the cattle business and about Aaron's family background, which was her mother's way of trying to fit him into categories she understood. Louisa answered those questions honestly. Aaron's father had been a Tennessee farmer. His mother had died when he was 12. He had come west on his own determination and built something on his own merits, and there was nobody in the world whose opinion she trusted more. The spring of 1883 moved into summer, and life on Hondo Creek established its rhythms. The days were long and the work was constant. Cattle and horses and fence and water, always water in the dry territory summers, and Louisa worked alongside Aaron without pretense, learning what needed to be learned and applying her mind to the parts of the operation that benefited from her particular skills. She took over the ranch's accounting completely, and within 3 months had identified 2 places where they were losing money unnecessarily. One in the arrangements with the buyer who purchased their cattle in the fall, and one in the supply arrangements with the Cimarron market that could be improved with a different schedule. Aaron listened to her analysis of both problems with complete seriousness and implemented her suggestions, and 6 months later, they had recovered $40 that had been leaking out of the operation, which in the context of a small ranch in 1883 was not nothing. He told Pete Morales about this during a spring branding where the neighboring ranchers helped each other out, and Pete laughed and said he needed someone like that. And Alina, who overheard, said that Pete needed someone exactly like that, but that he was not going to find one because there was only one Louisa. And Aaron said that was precisely correct, and his tone was so openly satisfied that Pete laughed again. There were difficulties, because the territory in 1883 was not a difficulty-free place. There was a summer drought that put pressure on the water in Hondo Creek and required careful management and some difficult weeks. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher to the north named Cass Beaumont, who was a large, loud man with a tendency to move his fence line incrementally in directions that were favorable to him, and who had a low opinion of Aaron that was both unexplained and consistent. Aaron handled this with a restraint that Louisa found admirable and occasionally maddening in equal measure, choosing the route of the county land surveyor and legal documentation rather than the more immediate routes that the territory often offered. And in the end, Beaumont's fence was moved back, and the matter was settled in a tedious but definitive way. Louisa, who had written a careful and devastating letter to the county commissioner's office documenting the fence discrepancy with precise measurements, received a letter from the commissioner acknowledging the resolution and complimenting the quality of the documentation, which Aaron pinned to the kitchen wall where other people would put decorative items. In August, she discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected it for several weeks before the certainty settled, and when she told Aaron, she watched the expression move across his face in layers, first the stillness of a man absorbing information of great weight, and then a quiet and total joy that was not the whooping, performative joy of men she had seen in stories, but rather the deep, real kind, the kind that shows in the eyes and the set of the shoulders and the particular way a person goes still, because they are trying to hold something carefully. He said, "Are you all right?" She said she was. He said, "We should get Dr. Mercer out here," who was the town's doctor, a spare, competent man of 45 who had trained in Philadelphia and come west for his health and stayed because he had found it mattered more to be needed than to be comfortable. She said she would go into town next week and speak to him. He said, "Louisa," and stopped. She said, "What?" He said, "I have been fortunate in ways I could not have told you 10 years ago were possible. And I know that most of it is because of a set of circumstances that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with a family in Virginia that decided to make a mistake. And I'm going to be grateful to that mistake for the rest of my life." She laughed, which was not what he had expected her to do, and he looked briefly surprised and then smiled. She said, "My family sent me out here as their last embarrassment. I was the problem they could not solve. They wrapped it up as a favor and put me on a train, and what they actually did was give me the best thing that ever happened to me." He said, "That works two ways, Louisa." She said she knew. The baby came in March of 1884, almost exactly a year after their wedding, and he was a boy, 7 pounds and some ounces, delivered by Dr. Mercer in their bedroom on Hondo Creek, with Alina Morales present in the way that Alina was present for everything important in the lives of the people she cared about, which was competently and warmly, and with a great deal of practical efficiency. Mrs. Hargrove had come out from town as well and made herself useful in the kitchen, which meant Aaron had been provided with coffee at regular intervals and something to do with his hands, which Dr. Mercer said was the best thing you could arrange for a first-time father. They named him James William Hayes, James for Aaron's father and William for no particular family reason, except that it had the right weight to it. And he was, as babies go, a demanding and vigorous person who had opinions about meals and sleep schedules that he communicated without ambiguity. Aaron held him with the careful wonder of a man who had not been certain he would be good at this, and was finding that the learning of it was the best project he had ever undertaken. Louisa wrote to her mother about the baby's birth. She wrote a thorough and loving description of him, his dark hair, which would likely darken further as Aaron's had, and his particular way of looking at things with a focused attention that she suspected was characteristic. She wrote with the confidence of a woman who was not asking for validation, but simply sharing something she was proud of. Her mother's reply, when it came, was more genuine than anything Louisa had received from her in years. Her mother wrote that she was glad the boy was healthy, and that she would be interested to see him one day, and that perhaps the family had perhaps not fully understood the circumstances when they had made the arrangements that had sent Louisa to the territory, and there was in those careful, qualified words the closest thing to an acknowledgment that her mother was capable of producing at this stage of their relationship. It was not a full reconciliation. It was not an apology. But it was a door that had been previously closed standing slightly open, and Louisa decided to treat it as such and see what time would do with it. The ranch grew. By the fall of 1884, Aaron had 41 head of cattle, and had taken on a ranch hand named Billy Roth, a quiet 20-year-old from Kansas who worked hard and kept to himself, and was learning the cattle business with the seriousness of someone who intended to have his own operation someday. Aaron taught him the way he had been taught by Gus Abernathy, which was thoroughly and without condescension, and Billy Roth turned out to be excellent with horses in a way that exceeded Aaron's own skill with them, which Aaron acknowledged without a trace of the wounded pride that Louisa had observed in other men when confronted with someone better at something than they were. She continued to manage the books and the accounts, and she had, in the spring of 1884, begun writing letters to the Cimarron News under her own name, L. Atwood Hayes, on the subjects of territorial land policy and water rights management, which were the pressing practical issues of the time and place. The letters were well-reasoned and specific, and they generated some controversy and some approval, and the county commissioner, a man named Hollister who had initially been dismissive of correspondence from a ranch wife, eventually acknowledged in person at a public meeting that the Atwood-Hayes analysis of the water rights situation along Hondo Creek was the most accurate and useful document he had received on the subject. Aaron, who had attended that meeting, had said nothing about this publicly, but on the drive home he had reached across the wagon seat and taken her hand and held it for the entire 9 miles back to the ranch without saying anything at all, which communicated everything that needed to be communicated. Pete Morales had been having a harder year. There was pressure from a land company out of Santa Fe that was trying to consolidate holdings in the area, and several smaller ranchers had already sold or been pressured out. The company used tactics that were legal in the narrow technical sense and profoundly unjust in every other sense, exploiting the ambiguities in the old Spanish land grant documentation that governed a good portion of the territory's land ownership, particularly for the families who had been on this land before the American period. This was the injustice that ran through the territory and through this time, that the land and the legal frameworks had been rewritten after the war, and the families who had held land under Spanish and Mexican grants faced constant challenges to their ownership from Anglo interests who had access to capital and lawyers, and a legal system that had been shaped without much input from them. Pete Morales had held his land for 15 years and had the documentation to prove it, but the land company had found a surveying dispute that put the eastern portion of his property in question. Aaron and Louisa helped him fight it. Louisa spent 3 weeks in the county record's office in Cimarron, going through documents with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had grown up learning that the detail work is where the truth lives, and she found, in a filing from 1867, a surveying record that clarified the boundary in Pete's favor beyond reasonable dispute. The land company's challenge collapsed, and Pete's land was confirmed. Pete stood in their kitchen afterward and looked at Louisa for a long moment and said, in his quiet way, "How do you thank someone for this?" she said. "By doing the same for someone else when the time comes," which was, she thought, the right answer. Elena Morales embraced her, and James, who was 8 months old and observing everything from his position on his father's arm, reached out toward Elena's bright beaded necklace with the focused ambition of someone who wanted to understand everything within reach. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was cold and still and full of the particular domestic contentment that Louisa had not known she was looking for when she had boarded that train from Richmond. James learned to pull himself upright on the furniture and then to take steps, and Aaron watched this process with an expression of complete fascination that she found endearing beyond reasonable description. The house on Hondo Creek was warm, and the shelves were full of books, and the kitchen smelled of the coffee that Aaron started every morning early, before the animals needed attention, because he had discovered in their first year of marriage that she was not fully herself until the second cup, and had arranged his mornings accordingly. She thought about the version of herself who had folded her mother's letter into a precise square, and packed her trunk, and boarded a train headed west not knowing what was waiting. She had been frightened, though she had not admitted it. She had been hurt by her family in a way that she had wrapped very tightly so it could not show. She had been convinced, in ways she had not consciously examined, that she was somehow fundamentally wrong, that the qualities that made her difficult and inconvenient for her family were flaws rather than simply herself. She was not convinced of that anymore. In the spring of 1885, Louisa's sister Cecily wrote to her directly, for the first time since the Richmond years. The letter was stiff and slightly awkward, with the quality of a person crossing a gap that had been established so long it had come to feel like terrain. Cecily wrote that she had a daughter, 9 months old, and that she had been thinking about Louisa and wondering how she was. She wrote that their mother had spoken about Louisa with what Cecily called a different tone lately, and that she thought perhaps things had been handled in a way that was not entirely right. Louisa read that letter sitting in the open doorway of the house in the afternoon light with James asleep in the next room, and the sound of Aaron working on the new fence line coming faintly from the east pasture, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was still tight. She wrote back to Cecily. A long letter, the longest she had written in years, about the territory and the ranch and Aaron and James, and the work and the land and the mountains, and the whole long, vivid, improbable story of how she had come to be here. She wrote it with the generosity of a person who has found their footing and no longer needs anything from the people they are writing to, only wants to be known. The correspondence between the sisters that developed from that first letter was one of the things that mattered in the years that followed. Not a full healing, not the erasure of what had happened, but a genuine resumption of something that the years of distance had interrupted. James had his first birthday in March of 1885, and the celebration was a gathering that had somehow grown to include most of the people who mattered in their world. Alina and Pete were there with their family, and Mrs. Hargrove, who had developed a devoted relationship with James based on a shared appreciation for apple pie, came out from town. Mr. Calloway and his wife came. Billy Roth, who had been with them for a year now, and had become as fixed a part of the ranch's operation as the horses or the water rights, sat on the fence with his hat pushed back and watched the gathering with the quiet pleasure of someone who belongs to something. Aaron, standing next to Louisa in the afternoon light with their son on his hip, said, "I keep thinking about the fact that none of this was supposed to happen. According to the plan your family had, you were supposed to be somebody's housekeeper on a ranch that no longer existed, and instead, he gestured at the general scene, the people and the land and the child and the house and the mountains behind it all. She said, 'Instead I'm here.' He said, 'Instead you're here.' And I'm going to be saying thank you to whoever is responsible for that for the rest of my life." The summer of 1885 was good. The rains came at roughly the right times, which in the territory was never guaranteed, and the herd had grown to 60 head, and the operation was stable and growing in the careful, sustained way that Aaron had always planned for. Billy Roth had taken on more responsibility and was as reliable as anyone Aaron had ever worked with. The ranch was a going concern. Louisa's letters to the Cimarron News had produced an unexpected development, which was a letter from a Mrs. Pratt in Santa Fe, who was involved in organizing the women of the territory around the question of women's suffrage. The territory of Wyoming had given women the vote in 1869, and the question was live in New Mexico as well, and Mrs. Pratt was collecting voices and arguments, and Louisa's pieces on land policy had come to her attention. They began a correspondence that was one of the more intellectually energizing relationships of Louisa's life, a connection with someone who understood her mind and shared her convictions and was doing something concrete about them. She talked to Aaron about this, and he listened in his way and said, "Go to Santa Fe if she invites you. James and I will manage," she said. "He's 17 months old. Can you manage a 17-month-old by yourself?" He said he had Pete and Alina next door and Billy Roth 200 yards away, and he suspected that together they could maintain one small boy, and his expression was so thoroughly unintimidated by the prospect that she laughed. She did go to Santa Fe in the fall for 3 days, for a meeting of the women Mrs. Pratt was organizing, and it was one of the most significant 3 days of her adult life up to that point. The women in that room were teachers and ranchers' wives and shopkeepers and a territorial judge's daughter and a woman who ran a freighting company, and they were all entirely serious about what they were doing and why. And Louisa came back to Hondo Creek 3 days later feeling more fully herself than she had since leaving Richmond. Aaron met her at the wagon with James on his arm, and James, who had apparently had a fine 3 days being indulged by everybody in the immediate vicinity, reached for her with the decisive confidence of a person who is very certain he wants something. She took him and held him against her and breathed the warm smell of him and felt the rightness of being home, the real rightness of a home that was genuinely hers. She told Aaron about the meeting and the women she had met and the arguments being made and the work that was being organized, and he listened over supper with his full attention and asked questions that were specific and thoughtful, and at the end he said, "You should write about it. Everything you've just told me, written the way you just said it, is exactly what people who haven't thought about this need to read." She wrote the piece that week and sent it to the Cimarron News, and it was published and then reprinted in the Santa Fe paper, and generated more letters to the editor than any piece that publication had run in 2 years, including several that were deeply opposed to everything she had argued. And she read all of them with the equanimity of a woman who is used to being told she is wrong, and has learned to distinguish between arguments that have substance and arguments that are simply expressions of discomfort with her existence. By the end of 1885, Aaron and Louisa Hayes had built something that was, by any honest measurement, genuinely good. The ranch was healthy, the community of people around them was real and sustaining, the work they did was meaningful, and the life they shared was the kind that had been built deliberately and specifically for who they were rather than who anyone else had decided they should be. In the winter, Louisa began to suspect she was pregnant again, and by January of 1886 she was certain, and she told Aaron on a cold, clear morning while James was still asleep, and the coffee was just ready and the mountains were going pink in the east light. He looked at her with the same layered expression she had seen the first time, the stillness, and then the deep, real joy, and then he said, "How are you feeling?" She said honestly that she was tired and a little unwell in the mornings but otherwise well. He said, "Let's get Mercer out to check on you." She said, "Aaron, I'm pregnant, not ill. I carried James to full term without significant difficulty. I suspect I will do the same this time." He said, "I know. I would still like Dr. Mercer to come out. Humor me." She said she supposed she could do that, and his smile at that was the private, warm one that was entirely for her. Their daughter arrived in August of 1886, on a hot, still morning when the air was the particular quality of New Mexico summer air that Louisa had long since stopped finding strange, and instead found as familiar and essential as the smell of coffee and the sound of the creek. She came into the world in the same room as her brother, with Dr. Mercer and Alina Morales in attendance, and she was small and definite and absolutely furious about the whole procedure, which Aaron said upon seeing her was a characteristic he recognized. They named her Clara Ann Hayes, Clara because it was a name that had weight and simplicity and no family obligation attached to it, just a name they both liked, and Ann for Alina Morales, who had been Alina Anita Morales and who was given this acknowledgement with her characteristic pragmatic warmth and only cried slightly, and only in the way Alina cried, which was with complete dignity. James, who was 2 and some months, approached his sister with the focused gravity of someone being introduced to a significant new piece of information about the world. He regarded her for a long moment and then looked at Aaron and said, very seriously, "Small." Aaron said, "She'll grow." James appeared to accept this, and then attempted to share with Clara his wooden horse, which Dr. Mercer intercepted gently, and that was that. The years moved on in the way that good years do, with enough texture and difficulty to feel real and enough joy and growth to feel like fortune. The ranch expanded, and Aaron brought on a second hand as the herd grew. Billy Roth had saved enough by 1887 to make a start on his own small property 10 miles north, and Aaron helped him the way Gus Abernathy had helped him, with his time and his knowledge and no conditions attached. And Billy Roth said thank you in a way that contained everything that needed to be said between two people who had worked alongside each other long enough to know each other's quality. James grew into a child who had his father's steadiness and his mother's curiosity, which combination made him, at 4, exactly as exhausting as it sounds. He followed Aaron around the ranch with the devoted attention of an apprentice and asked why and how about everything he saw, and Aaron answered every question, even the 9th repetition of the same question, with the patience of a man who had decided that his son's understanding of the world was worth investing in. He also, Louisa noticed, began teaching James to read earlier than most children were taught, using the same books she kept on her shelves, and when she asked why so early, he said that nobody had thought it mattered to teach him early and he had come to it late, and the lateness had cost him nothing ultimately, but it had felt like a gap he had to run to close, and he didn't want that for James. She loved him more in that moment than she had the day before, which was the pattern of their life together. Clara was, from the beginning, a person of strong and specific opinions. She wanted what she wanted and had no interest in accepting substitutes, and the expression she wore when presented with something she considered inadequate was so precisely her mother's expression that Aaron, upon first observing it, had to turn away to compose himself. She was sunny and fierce in equal measure, and by the time she was 18 months old she had the entire population of the ranch thoroughly managed. Pete Morales came over on a spring evening in 1888 and sat with Aaron and Louisa on the porch and talked about how the territory was changing, the railroad that had come through and the way it was bringing more settlers, and the ongoing pressure on the smaller and older land holdings, and the politics of statehood that were beginning to take on serious shape. They talked about it, the way people talk about things they are both a part of and subject to, with the practical specificity of people who live in a place, rather than the abstract theorizing of people who observe it from outside. Louisa said, "When statehood comes, if the Constitution is written right, there's an argument for women's suffrage in it. Wyoming has managed it." Pete said, "Wyoming is Wyoming," she said, "and New Mexico could be New Mexico. The women of this territory have been building it as long as the men have. The Mora Grant families, the women who ranched after their husbands died, Alina," she gestured. "The argument is there." Alina said from inside the house, where she was putting Clara to sleep at Louisa's request, "I can hear you making arguments on my behalf." Louisa said, "I'm making arguments on everyone's behalf." Alina said, "That's fine, just do it quieter so the baby sleeps." Aaron and Pete exchanged the particular look of two men who live alongside formidable women and have made their peace with it. The statehood question would take decades more, as it turned out. New Mexico would not become a state until 1912, and the suffrage question would be resolved federally in 1920, and Louisa Hayes would live to vote in her first presidential election in her late 60s, and would walk to the polling place in Redemption, which by then had grown to a real town, with Clara beside her, and Clara would be 34 years old with 2 children of her own, and the moment of it would be one of the most significant Louisa could remember. But that was in the future, and the story is still in 1888, which had its own considerable satisfactions. In the summer of 1888, Louisa's mother came to visit. She came alone, which was unexpected, and she came on the train, and then the stage to Cimarron, and Aaron drove out to collect her. And Louisa, who had known this was coming for 2 months and had spent those 2 months cycling between complicated emotions and arriving always back at a kind of composed preparedness, stood in the yard of the Hondo Creek Ranch when the wagon came up the road and watched her mother climb down with the stiff care of a woman who has spent several days in uncomfortable transit. Her mother, Isabel Atwood, was 61 years old and smaller than Louisa remembered, or perhaps the territory made everything seem smaller than the version you kept in memory. She stood in the yard and looked at the house and the mountains behind it, and the yard where chickens moved with their particular purposeful randomness, and the 2 horses at the fence line, And then she looked at Louisa with an expression that was complicated in ways her mother did not usually allow her face to be complicated. And she said, "Louisa," in a voice that had something trembling under its surface. Louisa said, "Mother," and stepped forward and embraced her, which she had not done in 6 years, and her mother held on for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. James, who was 4 and had no concept of complicated history, appeared from around the side of the house with both hands full of something he was examining and said, "Who is this?" Isabel Atwood looked at her grandson with an expression that went through several phases very quickly and arrived at something that was, in its core, simply delight. She stayed for 2 weeks. 2 weeks was long enough for Louisa to observe her mother observing the life she had built, and what she saw in her mother's observation was the slow, visible process of a woman recalibrating. Her mother was not a villainous person. She was a person who had been formed by a very particular world and had never previously had sufficient reason to question whether that world was the only valid one. She watched Aaron with her daughter and watched the particular quality of their marriage, the ease of 2 people who know each other fully and have chosen each other on that basis. And Louisa could see her mother working to fit it into categories she had not previously had. On the last evening before she left, after the children were asleep and Aaron had gone out to check on the horses with the tact of a man who understood that some conversations needed to happen without him, Isabel Atwood sat across the kitchen table from her daughter and said, "I want to say something." Louisa said she should say it. Her mother said, "I think we made a mistake. I don't know that your father would agree with me on that, but I think what we did when we sent you out here it wasn't right, Louisa. We treated you as though you were a problem, and what you are is a person. It was not a large speech. It was not an elaborate apology. It was the careful, qualified acknowledgement of a woman who had not been accustomed to acknowledging her own errors and was doing it anyway, and for that reason it was actually more moving than a larger speech would have been." Louisa looked at her mother for a moment and said, "I know." Her mother said, "Are you happy?" Louisa said, "I am, genuinely and specifically happy. Not the kind where you don't notice that anything is hard, but the kind where you know it's the right life." Her mother was quiet for a moment and then said, "He's a good man." Louisa said, "He is the best man I know." Her mother nodded once, with the deliberate quality of someone entering something into the record, and they sat together in the kitchen of the Hondo Creek Ranch in the New Mexico summer night and drank coffee and talked, carefully at first, and then with increasing ease, about things they had not previously been able to talk about. And by the time the candle was low, they were speaking with the particular exhausted intimacy of 2 people who have been working very hard to understand each other and have finally made some progress. Aaron came back in and said good night to Isabel Atwood with the same uncomplicated directness he brought to everything, and Isabel said good night and looked at him once more with the expression of a woman revising a long-held calculation, and then she went to bed, and Aaron sat down across from Louisa and said quietly, "All right," she said, "better than I expected." He said, "She loves you, she just didn't know how to." Louisa said, "I know. I've decided that's enough to work with." He reached across and put his hand over hers on the table, the same gesture from the boarding house dining room years ago, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the warm kitchen while the night settled over the ranch. Her mother left the next morning, and the parting was better than any they had managed in years, neither effusive nor cold, but genuine in the way of 2 people who have decided to keep trying. The fall of 1888 was a good one, the kind that makes a person feel the specific satisfaction of having accumulated something real. The herd was 78 head. The house had been expanded with a second sleeping room for the children and a proper porch that ran the length of the front of the house. The bookshelves were full. Louisa's correspondence with Mrs. Pratt and others involved in the suffrage work was ongoing and productive, and she had by this point become known in a certain circle across the territory as someone whose analysis was worth reading. She was 30 years old, and she had been in the territory for 6 years. And she was so completely rooted in this life that the Richmond version of herself felt like a person she had read about in a book, not unsympathetically, but at a real distance. James had started at the small school in Redemption that had been established 3 years earlier, and he went with Erin on the Wednesday morning drives into town, which had transformed from Erin's courtship visits into the family's regular town day. Clara, at 2, had strong opinions about being left at home on town day and was beginning to make a persuasive case for inclusion, primarily through the strategic deployment of an expression of grievance so comprehensive that it was difficult to argue with. On a Wednesday in October, Erin drove them all into town for supplies and a visit to the school, where Louisa spoke briefly with the schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Holland who had come out from Ohio and was doing a genuine and careful job with the children of Redemption. While Erin and the children were at the store, she stopped in at the post office and collected the week's mail, which included a letter from Mrs. Pratt, a letter from Cecily, who wrote regularly now and with real warmth, and a small package from Richmond that bore her father's handwriting. She stood on the post office step and looked at the package for a moment. Her father had not written to her in 6 years. Not once through the whole of it. Inside the package, wrapped in paper, was a small framed photograph, and inside the photograph was her family in their Richmond parlor, formally posed as photographs required. Her mother and father and Cecily's husband and their daughter, who was now 3, and they were looking at the camera with the careful, composed expressions of people who are being recorded for posterity. On the back of the photograph, her father had written in his formal hand, "To Louisa. We hope you are well. Your father, E.H. Atwood," that was all. But it was there and it had been sent, and she stood on the step in the October sun and felt something settle that had been unsettled for a long time, not fully resolved, not as though nothing had happened, but like a weight that had been shifted into a more manageable position. She was still standing there when Erin came around the corner with James on his shoulders and Clara tucked under one arm, and he saw her expression and stopped walking. She said, "My father sent a photograph." He came to her and looked at the photograph and said nothing for a moment and then said, "That took him a while," she said. "He's a slow man when it comes to change." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I am. I think I genuinely am." He put his free arm around her shoulders, which required some engineering given that he was still carrying Clara and James was still on his shoulders, and James said from above, "Why are we stopping?" And Clara attempted to reach for the photograph, and the whole thing dissolved into the mild, cheerful chaos of 2 small children who have no patience for complicated emotional moments, and Louisa laughed, which was the right response. That evening, back at the ranch, she sat at the kitchen table while Erin put the children to bed, a process that involved 2 stories and a firm conversation about going to sleep, and she wrote 2 letters. The first was to her father. It was not long and it was not lavish, but it was warm, and it was the first direct address she had sent to him since she left Richmond, and it included a description of the ranch and the children and the life she had built, and it ended with the words, "I am well, Father. I am more than well. I wish you could see it." The second letter was to Cecily, and it was long and full of the texture of the day. James at school and Clara's campaign for inclusion in the town trips, and the particular quality of the October light on the mountains, and what Erin had said that morning that had made her laugh so hard she spilled her coffee, and the ordinary specific details that make up a life that is genuinely being lived. When Erin came back into the kitchen, she was finishing the second letter, and he poured them both coffee and sat across from her, and waited for her to finish without rushing her, because patience was one of the things he did as naturally as breathing. She finished and put down her pen and looked at him across the table in the lamplight, and she felt in a way that was total and specific and entirely real the full weight of her luck. She said, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" He said, "Tell me." She said, "That Tuesday, when my mother's letter arrived, I was so angry and so frightened, though I wouldn't have said frightened at the time. And I was standing in my aunt's hallway thinking that my family was done with me, that I was being sent off like a problem to be solved, and everything felt like loss. She paused, and I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea what I was actually being sent toward. He said quietly, "Neither did I when you showed up at Mrs. Hargrove's. I had been doing fine. I had a plan and I was building something and I was fine." He looked at her. "And then you were there behind that desk and fine became completely inadequate," she said. "That is very romantic." He said, "I'm a romantic man. I keep it well hidden." She laughed and he smiled, and the fire settled in the grate. And outside the Hondo Creek Ranch, the New Mexico night was clear and vast and full of stars. And the mountains were a dark presence against the darker sky. And the cattle were quiet in the south pasture. And in the next room their children were asleep. The years after that were good years, not without their difficulties. Because life is not organized to be without difficulties, but good in the essential way. The way that means the difficulties are survivable and the good things are real. James Hayes grew into a young man who had, as Louisa had predicted when he was 4, the combination of his father's steadiness and his mother's curiosity, and who at 18 was already showing the qualities of a man who would make a genuine contribution to whatever he put his hand to. He had his father's ease with the land and the animals and his mother's precise mind. And he could argue historical land policy at the supper table, and then go out and read the weather in the mountains with equal facility. And Aaron watched him grow with the particular pleasure of a father who finds he genuinely likes the person his son is becoming. Clara grew into herself with the force of something that was always going to take that shape. She was, at 14, the most self-possessed person in Redemption, New Mexico, including her mother and most of the adults she knew. And she read everything she could acquire and had opinions about all of it, and had recently discovered that the combination of her mother's correspondence network and her own direct and specific manner of writing could produce results when deployed on subjects she found important. The schoolteacher, Miss Holland, who had stayed in Redemption and married a local man, said at a school meeting that Clara Hayes was the finest student she had ever taught and also the most demanding. And Aaron and Louisa had exchanged the private look of two people who recognize a thing they are equally responsible for. Louisa's father came to visit in 1892, alone, as her mother had come alone 4 years earlier. He was 67, and the train journey had cost him something. And he was quieter and more careful than she remembered from the Richmond years, which were the years when he had been at the height of his social authority. He sat on the porch of the Hondo Creek Ranch on the first evening and looked at the mountains in the dusk light for a long time and said very little, and Louisa sat beside him and also said very little, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. He said eventually, "I didn't think you'd manage." She said, "I know." He said, "I was wrong about that." She said, "Yes." He said, "You were always more than we credited. I think your mother and I had a very specific idea of what a life should look like, and you didn't look like it, and we interpreted that as a failing in you." He was quiet for a moment. It wasn't. It was the most direct thing he had ever said to her, she thought. Her father had been, in the Richmond years, a man who spoke in positions and announcements rather than in the direct examination of his own thinking, and this, whatever it had cost him to say, was different. She said, "I know you thought you were doing what was right." He said, "I'm not sure that's sufficient, but I appreciate you saying it." Aaron came out with coffee and handed cups to them both and sat on the other side of Louisa with his own cup. And the three of them sat on the porch of the Hondo Creek Ranch in the New Mexico dusk. And the conversation that followed was one of the better conversations of Louisa's life. Not because everything was resolved or every old wound healed, but because it was real, and her father was in it as himself, rather than as the role he had played for so many years. And she was in it as herself too. The version that had been built out here in this landscape, that did not try to appear other than what it was. She found, as the years settled into themselves, that she did not need to carry her family's original judgment of her anymore. It had been their measurement and not an accurate one, and she had long since replaced it with the measurements of people who actually knew her, Aaron first and most, and the community of redemption which had come to know her over a decade now, and her children who knew her in the most complete and unguarded way that people know their parents. By any honest account, she was well measured. The century turned, and Aaron Hayes was 45 and Louisa was 40, and they stood on the porch of their ranch, expanded now to a proper house, and watched the new year come in over the mountains with their adult son beside them and their nearly grown daughter who was already making plans for a life that would take her farther than redemption, but always, she said, back to this land, which was hers by the most fundamental right of knowing it and loving it. Aaron said on that New Year's night with the stars out and the cold sharp, "We've built something, Louisa," she said. "We have," he said, "worth coming out here for," she said. "I was sent here as an embarrassment. I want you to know that I have never once felt like an embarrassment in this life. Not once," he said. "You have never been one," and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and James handed out cups and Clara said something that made everyone laugh. And the night was cold and enormous, and the life they had built inside it was warm and specific and fully, completely theirs. The ranch at Hondo Creek went on. The cattle herd at its height numbered close to 200. The house grew with the family and then settled into the comfortable solidity of a place that knows its purpose. The bookshelves were replaced twice with larger ones and were always full. The letters Louisa wrote over the decades of her life could have filled several volumes, and in some sense did, because she wrote about the territory and its people and its politics and its beauty with the precision and love of someone who had chosen a place not by birth, but by the fullest exercise of her own will, and what she wrote was read and mattered. James married a young woman named Ruth, the daughter of a schoolteacher from Cimarron, when he was 24, and they built their own house on the eastern portion of the Hondo Creek land that Aaron deeded to him, and their first child, a boy, was born in 1902 and named Aaron after his grandfather, which occasion produced in the original Aaron Hayes an expression of such unguarded feeling that Louisa, watching it, felt the same wave of warmth and totality that had been moving through her ever since the September evening on Mrs. Hargrove's porch, when he had said it was his very good fortune that she was here. Clara went to school in Santa Fe, and then to the territory's normal school, and came back to Redemption as a teacher herself for several years, and then married a man named David Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American who ran a mercantile business in Albuquerque, and who was the kind of person who, upon being introduced to Louisa and Aaron Hayes, spent 2 hours asking them about the history of the land and the ranch and the people who had built Redemption. And Aaron shook his hand afterward with the particular warmth of a man recognizing someone who knows what matters. Clara's 2 daughters were named for their grandmothers, the first Elena, for Elena Morales, who died peacefully in 1908, having seen the territory of her birth become a state in progress, and the second Isabel, for Louisa's mother, who had made the long journey west a second time in 1898 and had held her great-grandchildren with an expression of complete, unguarded love. Pete Morales outlived his wife by 2 years and died in 1910 at the age of 78 on his own land, which had been confirmed and reclaimed and held through every challenge. And Aaron and Louisa and their whole family were at the funeral, and Aaron stood at the grave and said what he knew of Pete, which was that he was a man who had held his ground and kept his word and loved his people and the land they lived on, and that there was nothing more that could honestly be asked of any person. Aaron Hayes was 60 years old in 1915, and the years had put their marks on him in the ways that good years put marks on a person, weathering and depth rather than damage. He was still the same man, still direct and still patient, and still the person Louisa trusted most in the world to tell her the truth of a thing. His hair had gone to gray, and his face had the lines of decades of outdoor light, And he still rode out every morning to check the cattle before breakfast. And she still watched from the porch sometimes as he went, with the same small, involuntary lift of feeling that she had felt when she used to see his horse tied outside the livery in Redemption 30 years ago. She said to him once on an evening very much like many other evenings on the porch of the Hondo Creek Ranch with the mountains going their colors in the last light, "Do you ever think about the person you were before I came?" He said, "Sometimes." He was doing fine. He had a plan. She said, "You always say that." He said, "It's always been accurate." He was doing fine. He paused. But he was lonely in a way he had come to think was just how things were, and he didn't know that it wasn't. She said, "I was sent out here to be gotten rid of. I want you to understand that I know how fortunate I am that they did." He said, "I told you the first time it was their loss and my good fortune." She said, "You did." He said, "I was right." She said, "You were absolutely right," and took his hand, and they sat together on the porch of the life they had built while the light did what it always did over the New Mexico mountains, which was go golden and then copper, and then the deep, clear color that she had never found a word for but which felt, after all these years, like home. The ranch at Hondo Creek stood for decades more, through James and then through his children, and the name Hayes on that land became one of the things that had been there a long time, like the creek itself, and the mountains and the particular quality of the light. The letters Louisa had written were kept, first in the tin box and then in better storage, and some of them were read aloud at a gathering in Redemption in the 1940s when the town celebrated its history, and the woman reading them said she wished she had known Louisa Atwood Hayes, and an old man in the audience who was James's son said, "She was the most herself person I ever knew," which was exactly right. Aaron Hayes died in 1919 at 64, not suddenly but not slowly either, in the house on Hondo Creek with the view of the mountains and his family around him and Louisa beside him. And the last thing he said to her was said quietly, with the directness that had been characteristic of him all his life, and she held his hand until the morning. And then she got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee because that was what the morning required, and because it was what they had done every morning of their life together, and she was not going to stop doing it now. She lived another 16 years, and they were full years, useful years, years in which she remained herself with the completeness of a person who has had long practice at it. She voted in 1920 with Clara beside her as she had known she would. She wrote until her eyes began to fail her, and then she dictated, to James's wife Ruth and to Clara's daughters who came to visit. And the words were the same quality because she had not lost her mind or her convictions or her capacity for precise observation. She died in 1935 in the same house on Hondo Creek where she had come as a bride, in the room that looked east toward where the light came first in the mornings. And she died in the deep sure knowledge that her life had been her own, built on her own terms in a place that had received her not as an embarrassment, but as exactly what she was. And that the greatest fortune she had ever come into was the fortune of being loved by a man who had seen her clearly from the beginning and never once wanted her to be anything other than entirely herself. The mountains beyond Hondo Creek had stood before any of them arrived, and they stood after, and the creek ran in the spring and went low in the summer drought and came back, and the land remembered what had been built on it, and there was nothing left unfinished, nothing left unsaid, nothing left unresolved, only the long, complete story of a woman who was sent away as her family's last embarrassment and arrived instead at the very center of the life she was meant to have.